the Section 420, Talkin Yankees. As everyone knows, the 80s were amazing. Well, maybe not for Yankee World Championships, but everything else. My next guest is J.Daniel. His book, Phinally, focuses on the 1980 season, some stories that you might remember, maybe some stories you never even heard of before. So here he is to talk about his book. Hi, Jay. Thanks, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, J.Daniel, people can follow you on Twitter, J.Daniel2033, and plus you run the website, 80sbaseball.com, as well as your Facebook page, 80s Baseball on Facebook. Actually has a big following. So again, thank you. It's nice to have you on the show. So you had a book come out recently, Phinally, but of course spelt, Phinally. So you grew up a Phillies fan, is that correct?
Yeah, I grew up in Southwest Ohio, in the heart of Big Red Machine country, and I was a Phillies fan. My mother is from Philadelphia, and when you're 6 or 7 years old and one of your parents roots for a certain team, that's as good enough a reason as any to root for that team. And so I started following the Phillies at a young age, and they were good at that point. And so that really helped, obviously, right around the time where they won the 3 straight division titles. So I started to follow them, and so that 1980 team was a real special team for me. I mean, I think as a general rule, I would say anytime you're a younger kid and a team that you root for wins a championship in any sport, I think that team is sort of ingrained in your mind. And I know I can still go back and, name just about every guy that played on that team. And I'm sure a lot of other people in similar circumstances can as well. I'm sure you could probably name a lot of guys off the 77, 78 Yankees team as well, too. So.
Correct. And, just for Yankee fans now, of course, one of the members of that 1980 team was Bob Boone, father of Aaron Boone, the current Yankee manager. And again, a couple Hall of Famers, Steve Carlton, Mike Schmidt, and someone who should be in the Hall of Fame, Pete Rose, but that'll be remain to be seen someday, and Larry Bowa. So definitely a great team. Now, also, on your website, as you highlight, you feel that for some reason the 1980 decade also just transformed baseball and the world and everything. Can you just give us a little insight on that?
Well, I'm just a big 1980s guy. I mean, I was sort of born in that sweet spot where basically all of my high school and college career, so to speak, was spent in the same decade. And so I'm a huge fan of everything 1980s. I love the music. I love the movies, the kitschy clothes. I'm going to pop my collar later on when I, leave the house. So, I mean, I'm just a big 80s guy. And I think And the other thing that's sort of unrelated about the 80s is just there's, a lot of technological advances came out in that decade. And it's really interesting to go back and look through these old newspapers when I'm researching things and see stuff like, VCRs that were $1,000. I love everything about the era. And so it's a big nostalgia trip for me. And also, I'm also learning a lot about what actually took place that year, because as someone who grew up in Ohio, I didn't really find out much about the American League teams. I never saw a guy like Rod Carew play unless it was in the All-Star game. There with no interleague play, you didn't get a chance to see guys like that. And then, the other part of it is that I would get that early newspaper, and I'm sure you may have experienced this some as well, where you get that newspaper and it says late game not included, so a game is played on Monday. You may not find out who won until Wednesday when you get the paper that says, with the late box scores, or you could call a phone number and pay for a long distance call to find out the score of a game. So, I mean, it's you start to learn a lot of things, and, obviously we didn't have the national coverage then that we do now. So it's been a lot of fun to dig through all this stuff.
That's actually a great point, because I remember growing up myself. So I was born in 81. So I just made it in there. So
there you go.
Yeah, but I remember, of course, I would follow the Yankees, and again, only see American League players. So a player like an Andre Dawson to me, or it almost seemed like an alien. It's like, what's this National League team? Like, you would never see them. And again, we didn't have cable growing up, so maybe I would have the baseball card, but you never seen these guys play. And I mean, now it's like players are in or out with interleague and trades all the time, so you see these players. But back then, for me at least, and probably the same for you for American League players, it was a switch. For me, National League players, I just, I would never see them. And so I would see these names like Tony Gwynn being a great hitter, but really never really got to see him until maybe the Yankees played him in the 98 World Series.
Yeah, exactly. And again, when you start to talk about guys like Tony Gwynn, and for me, Rod Carew, and some of those guys, sort of Rod Carew, or maybe guys with really good players for teams that didn't do very well. Maybe you see them get an at bat in the All-Star game, but they're never going to be on the, on the Saturday afternoon game of the week. They're never going to be on Monday Night Baseball because they don't draw. And so you really would get, in some instances, you might get to see 1 or 2 at bats of some of these guys per season if you weren't in that market. And, and as a contrast, now I have a friend of mine who is a good friend of mine. His son plays for the Reds. And if he does something, if he hits a home run and I can't see it on my phone within 15 minutes, I'm going, what is going on? What is taking so long? So the experience of being a fan now is so much different than it was, which is, an understatement. And it's also a duh. Well, of course it is. But when you sort of really look at it at a granular level, it really is kind of impressive the strides that have been made and what we can see and do now, as opposed to what we saw and did when we were growing up.
That's an excellent point. And we'll get to your book in a moment, but also what I found fascinating, again, just kind of, I was going through the Facebook page, some of the hitters you highlight, and it makes you think it's had some great hitters in the 80s, just pure hitters like Don Mattingly, of course, but Wade Boggs, George Brett, Gwynn, like type of players that, when they're healthy in their prime, they were able to hit like 350. You just don't see those type of hitters anymore because, again, now with the home run and all that stuff, they just don't hit for average.
Yeah, and that's really a shame. And maybe, in my opinion, and maybe this is me being the crusty old guy and get off my lawn, but I mean, I love the fact that guys would hit 350, 360 in a year. I would love to see the game return to that. I mean, part of the reason that those guys hit that well is because they weren't playing against shifts. And if you have a shift, basically the best way to beat it is to go over it. And so I completely understand that. I mean, from a strategy perspective, but I love that style of game from that era of hitting the opposite way, hitting line drives, stealing bases. I mean, I would love to see the stolen base come back into the game. And, and you can talk to me all you want about how, from a mathematical standpoint, it doesn't make sense. And I understand that on an intellectual level, but I don't care. I want to see guys steal bags. I want to see, Ricky Henderson stole 100 bases, by August 1st in 1982. I want to see that because it was fun. It made the game exciting.
Yeah, because now it's just like they rather just work, get a walk, put 2 guys on, and they figure at some point someone's gonna hit a 3-run homer, and that's great. But again, I read something like last year that basically the average baseball game now has like almost the first 5 innings. There's literally no action. There's no hits. There's no moving the there's nothing. It's just walk, strikeout, or home run. So again, I feel like the 80s was like that last maybe decade of like the contact hitting. Cause then when you get into the 90s, so I get into like juicing and home runs and all that stuff. And really to me, like the 80s was that last, era of really just pure baseball.
I agree. I mean, and the other part that's now become a dinosaur is the complete game. And again, when you have guys that sit at 98, 99, I mean, I don't know that it's physically possible, but you're not going to see the complete games. But Rick Langford threw 23 straight complete games in 1980. I mean, so I remember, again, we're talking about differences in eras, right? So in that early 80s, you had Nolan Ryan, J.R. Richard in 1980 until he had his health issues, and Goose Gossage, and everyone talked about how hard those guys threw. And now every team has 7 guys in the bullpen that throw harder than those guys do. And Ryan could throw, I mean, if he wanted to, he could have been a max effort guy and throw, 5 innings and throw every pitch at 99, but he knew how to pitch. And so those guys worked in the low 90s and dialed it up when they needed to. But now guys come in and they know they're only going to have to throw an inning out of the bullpen, or maybe a starter knows he's probably only going to have to go 5 or 6 unless it's an elite starter. And so they just blow gas the whole time, and, whatever happens and leave it all out there. And again, you go back and watch some of those old games on YouTube. I mean, I remember watching again for a game from 82 with Mike Caldwell pitching, and he's working in the mid 80s. I mean, it's just unheard of to see that now. And again, those guys could pitch, and not to say that, that Justin Verlander doesn't know how to pitch. I mean, obviously he does, But he's an exception. I think there are more guys in that era that really knew how to pitch and work the ball around than now, because now everybody just relies on velocity. And again, I think that's something, me being the crotchety old man, maybe that's something that, I again would love to see return, but I don't know that you're going to ever see that again.
Yeah, and again, the reason, like I said before, like every guy, they have their stable of guys that throw 98, like the Tampa, but that's why they're getting like, great, you have a good season, but a season later they're having like Tommy John surgery, and you got to
Right.
show. I mean, pretty much every major pitcher now at some point has to get Tommy John surgery, just because, like I said, they're probably just throwing it all out there and tearing these ligaments and stuff. And yeah, again, it's good to have a good bullpen that's effective, but again, when everything's just strikeouts or walk or a home run, again, it's a different quality of game to watch. And, I think that's part of the reason there's some viewership's been dropping off at ratings. But let's get into your book now, Phinally, again, about the 1980 season. So, what just gave you the inspiration to start it and publish it and, get it out there?
Well, to be honest with you, one of the main things that inspired me was Dan Epstein's book about 1976 called Stars and Strikes, which I can't recommend enough. Dan is really a very, very good writer, and I've actually gotten to know him. He's a really good guy who was very helpful for me. But I read his book and really liked the way that he did it, because if you're writing a book about a season that's already happened, obviously you're not breaking news. I mean, no one's going to read my book to find out who won the 1980 World Series. And so you've got to give the reader something else. And so that's what Dan, I thought, did a great job of mixing in pop culture and world events. And so that kind of became the blueprint for me. I originally was going to write a book about the entirety of the decade, but I got so engrossed in all of the little nuances and all the little one-off things that happened. Freddie Patek hit 3 home runs in a game. And all, guys set this record or fights or whatever, that all of a sudden I realized I was 50 or 60 pages into writing about 1980, and I hadn't even begun to tell the story of the season yet. And so at that point, the book is going to be 1,000 pages if I write about the entirety of the decade. And it's really tough to condense an entire season into 30 pages. So I'd done most of the work on 1980. I was a Phillies fan, so it became a natural transition kind of to just say, okay, I'm going to go all in on 1980, and then hopefully work through the rest of the decade, or many of the other years of the decade as well. And so that's sort of the genesis of it. And then, again, you just go through and read as much as you can possibly read. And I've always been someone who's read a lot of baseball biographies and baseball books. I'm a big stats guy. And so you go through and look at all these different things. And again, when there were fights, or someone hits 4 home runs in a game or 3 home runs in a game, or, drives in a bunch of runs, or their record set or whatever. And you look for stories and just try to weave a narrative together. And that becomes kind of the challenging part. And then again, you start to mix in those pop culture elements I talk about. The Shining and the Blues Brothers and Mount St. Helens and Caddyshack in the book as well. So that makes it a lot of fun, I think, and it helps sort of anchor the book in time, because at the end of the day, if you're just writing about wins and losses, the book could be about just about any year. And I tried to stay away from play-by-play as much as I can, because again, you're not breaking news, and also it's just boring. I've read a bunch of baseball books, and if I want to find out who won a game on a certain day, I'll go to Baseball Reference and look it up myself. I don't need you to tell me. I mean, you have to do some of it, but I don't need a rundown of 5 innings of a game. Tell me about and give me some detail about what happened, or give me some quotes. And so that's what I tried to do with this book, and what I'm working on with the next one as well.
Gotcha. So did you pretty much just rely on like old news clippings? I mean, did you reach out to anybody or any other reporters or anything during that era?
To briefly answer your question, no, I didn't do any interviews. I did everything from old news clippings and books and YouTube videos and stuff like that. Part of the reason is that I still have a full-time job, and so it would have been really difficult for me. I certainly would have been difficult for me to travel. I could have done a lot of these interviews over the phone, but the way that I work, I think I probably would still be doing interviews right now if I had tried to do that, because I talked to one person and then they'd mention something, and I'd say, oh, well, I need to talk to that person. And, and so I decided up front to not do that, purposely not do that. I've reached out to some other people with with the next one, and I haven't gotten any responses, but that's fine. I mean, I think there's enough there between, you know, Baseball Digest and Sporting News and daily newspapers and athlete biographies and YouTube videos and everything else that's out there that you can piece it all together and still come up with a good story. I mean, I would love to be able to sit down and talk to 100 of these guys, but I don't have, you know, the time or kind of the wherewithal at this point to do that.
Gotcha. And again, the book finally, it's available on Amazon. And, you know, beyond just of course, the World Series, but what were some of the other side stories of, you know, or mini little dramas within that season that, you know, that you bring up in this book?
Well, I mean, you start to get into some drug issues. So, I mean, Fergie Jenkins got busted with some marijuana at the border. And so there was that issue. The Phillies had sort of a drug scandal. Again, but I mean, I think for me, and then there's the Joe Charbonneau story, which was just really fun. You know, it was a guy who briefly appeared and burned brightly and then burned out. But he's still a beloved guy in Cleveland. And so that was really fun to look into. And again, just all the one-off stories. I mean, Freddie Patek hits 3 home runs in a game. That Cardinals get into some of the members of the Cardinals got into a fight on the sidewalk outside of a hotel in Cincinnati. And, you know, that Nolan Ryan signing with the Astros, that gave them the 2 reigning strikeout champions, National and American League champions. And then of course, J.R. Richard had a stroke, which was awful. And he was treated extremely poorly. And so when you start to look at that story in retrospect, it's pretty powerful, the way that all happened. And then, you know, then there's the story of George Brett's chase for 400, and how just a phenomenal season that he had that year. And then the Phillies were just a really interesting story, I think, in general, with Dallas Green coming in. He took over at the end of the 1979 season, wasn't a real popular guy with the players and had a lot of run-ins with a lot of players, especially the veterans. Pushed those guys pretty hard. And, you know, at the end, it was all hugs and kisses in the locker room after they won the World Series. But up to that point, there were a lot of ruffled feathers. So there were some interesting stories that I got to dig into. And I think that was a big part of it for me and a lot of fun for me. And I think the other thing I've noticed when I post things on my Facebook page or my Twitter feed, the 2 responses I often get are, wow, that's amazing. I've never heard that before. And then on the same one, I'll get, I was at that game. I remember I was sitting there with my dad. We were in the 3rd row, blah, blah, blah. And so that is really cool to me because I feel like in addition to writing this book, I've also built a community with people who are all invested in this era of the game and love it and all have fond memories like I do. And so that's been really fun and really rewarding. And some people will just send me messages saying, hey man, I just found your site. Thanks so much. It's really cool. It brings back a lot of memories. And that's cool. Gives me all the feels, you know?
Yeah. And again, I just checked out your site just for a couple of days and I was like, you know, remembering plays and like you see Ruben Sierra for like, you know, being thin. I'm like, wow, Ruben Sierra thin, you know, from the minor leagues. But no, definitely, again, Facebook, check it out, 80s Baseball. And really quick, although one of the stories, just for get a little Yankee twist on it, there's something like Reggie Jackson got held up at gunpoint or something. One of the
Twice.
Yeah.
It was an interesting season for Reggie. I mean, he had his best season in terms of he was the only year he hit 300. He tied for the league lead in home runs, and had George Brett not had the year that he had, Reggie likely would have won the MVP that year. But yeah, then Reggie had 2 different run-ins late night at restaurants or out and about in New York where he could have been shot. And in one instance, there were actually shots fired. That's something that I get into a little bit. And so, I mean, again, you think about, you know, it's a huge what if, and you know, who knows how close things came, but yeah, there were 2 different instances. Once where someone tried to sort of steal his Rolls Royce. And then another instance where, you know, there were 2 guys that approached him after he got out of a restaurant. It was the night he hit his 400th home run. And he came out of this restaurant and had a little run in with some people. So, pretty interesting stories that you don't often see anymore, but you know, that was New York in 1980.
Your next project you work on is going to be about the 1982 season. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm working on a book about 1982 with the University of Missouri Press. So that book is tentatively due out in the spring of 2022. So I'm finishing up my manuscript right now, and it'll take roughly a year or so to get to print. But that one I'm really looking forward to, because now I have a much better idea of what I'm doing. I do a lot more pop culture stuff, and I think in 1982 is kind of the year where, in my estimation, where the 80s became the 80s. I mean, in 1980 you have movies and music that came out that year but were done in 1970 and 1979. And obviously it's not the case that when the January 1st of a new decade, you say, okay, everybody, we're flipping the switch now. Everybody dress differently and talk differently, and and the movies are going to be different. And so it's an evolution, right? And so with 82, now Fast Times at Ridgemont High came out in 1982. I just finished writing about that, and just there's another real cool story about a guy named Lawn Chair Larry, who ended up he wanted to just float above his neighborhood with by tying some balloons to a lawn chair, and ended up getting about 16,000 feet up in the air. And that was part of that story, was part of the inspiration for the movie Up. And so there's all these little stories that I talk about. And again, the consumer, Atari came out, or Pac-Man came out for Atari that year. And then ColecoVision was released in 82. And so I get into a lot of those stories. And then again, the baseball, you've got the Cardinals with all the moves that Whitey Herzog made, and they finally paid off, beginning in the winter meetings of 1980. And then everything came, to fruition in 82. And then that Milwaukee Brewers team was a really, really fun team to watch, with Harvey's wall bangers. And they just, pounded the crap out of the ball, and they were fun. So there's a lot of fun stuff that happened that year. I'm digging into all of it, and hopefully I can pare it all down to make it palatable for people to read.
Obviously, if you're a Philly fan, and Yankee fans are the same, we have no patience. We want to win now. So, what's just the general feeling Philly fans have towards the team right now, with managed by Girardi, and obviously you have Bryce Harper and all that? I mean, what's
frustration with the front office? And everybody wants them to re-sign Real Muto, but it's not looking like that is going to happen. He may end up in New York, although on the other side of town. But I mean, yeah, Phillies fans are pretty frustrated when you go out and spend the money that they have, and you still don't get the results. I mean, personally, I don't think it's Girardi's fault. I don't know that you can blame Joe Girardi. He's obviously proven himself to be an excellent manager. They need some more personnel. The bullpen was a disaster. So that's been a rough part, but I mean, I think they'll certainly spend the money that they have to spend. It's just a question of when they're going to gel. And then, and maybe you look back at, what happened when the Phillies brought in Pete Rose in 1979 and ended up taking a nosedive after they'd won the division 3 years in a row. And then they turned back around in 1980 and did it. So hopefully for Phillies fans, that will be the case in 2021, but that remains to be seen. But I can't wait. We've been too long without baseball. So I'm ready for spring training to start.
Yeah, I mean, in general, the season, obviously, I say the season counts. He's only 60 games, but it's hard. Like, again, maybe if you had a full season, the Phillies or any other team could have had a great second half and maybe storm back in. But in terms of the relationship, because obviously here in New York, we're not, have a thumb on what's going on. But in terms of Girardi and Harper, I mean, do they get along? Because Girardi's a very stickler, and we've seen Harper in the past be a little chippy about certain things. And I mean, I could see. I always thought those two would butt heads, but have they been able to get along at least?
Not that I think they have gotten along as best as I know. I think Harper's really happy to be in Philadelphia, at least outwardly. And he, this is from what I heard when he was looking to sign this deal, he wanted a long-term deal because he didn't want to go through the free agency process again. And so he said he wanted to go somewhere where he'd be able to stay. I think he obviously has respect for Girardi, because you have to. And, I think those two should be fine. It's a question of whether or not they can, get the other pieces that they need. There's been some problems with that pitching staff, and both starting and relieving. And so I think that's, to me, the bigger issue is just what can they do around Bryce Harper to get them back up to where they want to be.
Gotcha. So, and when they signed Harper, I mean, for the Yankees, I didn't want them to spend money, but I thought for Harper in Philly, that Citizen Bank ballpark, I mean, he hit like 1 million home runs. So he definitely, of course, is going to be a future Hall of Famer. And again, we'll see if, again, as long as he stays healthy. But for this upcoming season, 2021, I mean, you think they'll be able to start this time in April, or is it going to be kind of a pushback like you see in maybe like in the NBA?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think the next couple of months are going to be really telling to see what happens. I think, I mean, the problem with pushing the season back is, I mean, it's going to get cold and you're going to have to start to play. I mean, you saw the neutral site World Series and postseason this year, and I think you might see that again. Certainly, they would have to if they push things back again. I'd love to be able to sit, to see. I mean, we still have 4 months until spring training, right? So, or 3. So I'd love to see, us get things under control in the next 3 months, and let's open spring training, or maybe you have a shorter spring training because, I mean, nobody needs 35 spring training games. And I mean, you could cut the games in half, and maybe start spring training 2 or 3 weeks later and still start the regular season on time. It would be a little bit tougher for some teams to make some personnel decisions, but generally it's only a handful of roster spots. So I think that might be the way to go, is to start spring training late. And then, and maybe, I mean, I know they like the bubble format. Maybe you do spring training in a bubble and, make sure that everybody's okay. I mean, I know MLB wants to have fans back in the ballpark. I know fans want to be back in the ballpark. So I think they'd be better served, in my opinion, by starting things late and hopefully, resuming a normal season rather than trying to start something when everything isn't ready. And then all of a sudden you've got to make adjustments on the fly again, which didn't work out well.
Gotcha. And in this term of a baseball season, I mean, one option might be reducing, obviously not down to 60, but maybe they do go back down to the 154. I mean, do you feel like this in general as a fan, like the baseball season's too long?
I don't know. I mean, I love the fact that it's as long as it is. And I think if you want to reduce to 154, owners aren't going to like that because they're going to lose the gate revenue. And then you also have to readjust all the TV contracts. So there's a lot of moving parts that go into that. But I think 162 games is fine for me. I don't have a problem with it at all. I mean, for me, the more baseball, the better. And that's a biased opinion. I think if you want to look at practical things, if you drop that back down to 154, maybe you can end the season earlier or start it later, which could help with weather. And then, make adjustments that way. But I'm perfectly fine with 162 season. I think that's game season. I think that's one of the big parts about baseball that makes it so great, is the fact that the team that wins a division over 162 games really earned it. And again, we talked about the short season with this past year. Look what happened with the Nationals the year before, right? Where, I mean, they were awful at the beginning of the year and then had this tremendous second half and ended up winning the World Series. And so those are the kinds of things that you don't get in a short season in any sport. And so that's why I think it's, I'd love to stay at 162.
No, I'm totally with you on that. So Jay, again, appreciate to have you on. Again, your book Phinally available on Amazon. Again, check out the website, 80sbaseball.com, as well as your Facebook page, 80s Baseball. Again, to see some pictures of some of these old players, like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. And it's a really great site. So appreciate having you on. So hopefully, the 2021 World Series is Yankees Phillies. How about that?
There you go.